We talked about debt briefly in our consumption segment, and we'll revisit it here with some more empirical evidence of how debt manifests in the U.S. economy. I'm going to talk specifically about household debt, rather than corporate or interbank debt, which we considered earlier, or national debt, which is also of interest and relevance. Household debt is as old as history, and usually involved the surrender of one's property, children, and even oneself in payment. But this debt was understood to impede future production. Thus, the book of Leviticus describes the Jubilee, or Year of Liberty, where household debts were erased, slaves were returned to families, and land returned to original owners. Sometimes the time frame was every 7 years, which is echoed in U.S. bankruptcy law. In other ancient societies, a new ruler would begin his reign with a jubilee, and regular jubilee programs were described in both Hammurabi's Code and the Rosetta Stone text. Consumer debt in our modern industrial society, however, is a relatively new phenomenon. The first general-purpose credit card was issued by American Express in 1958, with Visa and MasterCard in 1968. Household debt falls into several categories. There's mortgage debt, there's non-revolving debt, which are mainly car loans, education loans, or recreational vehicle loans, and revolving debt, which are credit card debt and overdrafts. Aside from mortgages, consumer debt is not about taking advantage of leverage, as there's no expected return on investment. Rather, this debt is enabling consumption. Here's an animated time series of household debt to income ratios for all counties in the U.S., not including mortgages or education loans. And here's another Fred graph of revolving and non-revolving consumer credit, which doesn't include mortgages. Note that accounting change from 2010 that doubled the amount of consumer debt assets banks were required to report. Here's another Fred with the story of commercial bank credit card interest rates. Yes, that's a 140% increase over the last year. Wealth or income inequality doesn't necessarily imply debt, but increasing household debt in the U.S. is correlated to increasing inequality. Inequality and debt don't have direct theoretical links. According to rational expectations, no one would choose to go into debt, so there's no theory around the economic effects of debt. We observed previously that financialization based on loan assets requires a debt, so the market for debt obligations increases with the market for financial assets. But what does this mean for households across the income spectrum? Thinking in terms of target incomes, debt could be the result of borrowing to cover increases in costs, such as in housing, where wage increases are insufficient to meet those cost increases. Here is a Fred demonstrating housing price increases in urban areas. That's a consistent increase across time. Up to the 1930s, U.S. mortgages were structured as short-term, interest-only loans with usually 50% down payments. Loans were due upon maturity, otherwise they needed to be refinanced. New Deal arrangements brought about longer-term mortgages with structures that paid down principal as well as interest. Mortgage insurance was created that protected lenders against default, thus making mortgages less risky for lenders. During this time, mortgages were also packaged and securitized, thus becoming saleable financial assets rather than debt relationships with individual banks. For a related metric, here is a Fred of median house prices from 1970 to today, along with household mortgage liabilities. Notice the sale price peak around 2008, while mortgages peak around 2009. Thus, mortgage liabilities lag sale prices. If those houses sold at higher prices because high principal mortgages were made available, then the market or demand for mortgage debt drove up housing prices. Mortgage loans are not a service to a home buyer, rather a component of a securitized asset for which there is or isn't a demand. If the extent of the market determines the division of labor, then the extent of the asset market determines the need for debt obligations. And what about insufficient wages to meet target incomes? This table from the Government Accountability Office shows 51% of SNAP, which is Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, recipients are full-time workers. That's 9 million workers for SNAP. Walmart, McDonald's, and Dollar General are the top 3 employers of SNAP recipients. That's over $1 billion in SNAP, but there's also almost $2 billion in Earned Income Tax Credits, EITC. At the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour, that's $15,080 annually, at which point all categories are earning maximum levels of tax credits. There is solid evidence of increasing household debt in the U.S., and we've speculated about causes such as housing costs and insufficient wages. We didn't consider Kirkian social aspects, such as keeping up a standard of living that induces the perception of admiration. Systemically, we can hypothesize that consumer debt reduces effective wages because those wages need to include debt servicing. Consumer debt increases effective demand by allowing more consumption, at least in the short term. Demand for loan instruments drives the increase in debt. Consumer debt may increase long-term consumption on the part of asset owners, and to some extent, debt in the system should show up elsewhere as wealth. Again, coming to an understanding of debt dynamics will require complexity methods.